Yes, we can.
Great, we'll start in about 1 minute. Can you see me?
We see you now.
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, welcome everybody to the Aquatic Sciences session of the KGML workshop. I'm Paul Hanson from the University of Wisconsin, and along with my colleague Hillary Dugan, also from the University of Wisconsin, will be co-chairing this session. On behalf of Hillary and all the people who put a lot of hard work into making this workshop happen, thank you for coming and joining us this afternoon. And a big thank you to our presenters as well. They're listed here on the screen. This is the order in which you'll see the talks today. We've got a diversity of perspectives and some really great talks lined up. We'll go straight through talks until 3 o'clock this afternoon, at which time we'll take a short 10-minute break and we'll resume at 3:10 and continue on till 4:10, at which time we'll have a panel discussion where we clean up some of the unanswered questions. The format of the talks will be pretty standard for our field. Each one is about a 20-minute slot, holding a little bit of room at the end of each talk, hopefully for some Q&A. A reminder that questions are done by a Slido, so it's a very easy technology to use. Please ask questions, please connect and get in there. We're looking forward to a really vibrant, not only set of talks, but a vibrant discussion as well. A few thoughts about KGML from an aquatic ecologist perspective. For those of us who began working with Vipin Kumar and his group a few years ago, this was one of those rare and treasured aha moments for us. It was an aha moment when we learned that decades of hard research or hard work we put into our research that's instantiated in the models that we use to model our ecosystems wasn't going to be replaced by machine learning, but in fact had something to give to machine learning, to make machine learning even better. And indeed gave us access to the most contemporary machine learning, that is deep learning, that typically we don't have enough data to use within our field. And so by combining the knowledge and machine learning, we can do better than either one of those in terms of model performance. The predictions are better. Predictions outside of sample are better. We can conform to physical laws and ecological principles that we think are important. And from an ecologist perspective, it's really important to feed back to our knowledge of the system. So we've also learned that we can learn things about our model and therefore about the underlying theory that goes into those models. You're going to hear a lot about water quality today. So why water quality? All of our futures depend on water quality. The sustainability of the planet depends on fresh water and its availability. We do know that water quality is diminishing globally, but we've kind of a poor quantification of the state of ecosystems around the globe. And we just are beginning to understand what, especially at broad space and time scales, is affecting changes in water quality. Most of the estimates that we have of water quality are empirical in nature and from statistical models at broad space and time scales. And yet we have a lot of rich information about ecosystems, and we've developed a lot of process-based and physical models too, but they tend to be applied at the local level. And why is this a particularly good problem for KGML? Well, there are a lot of lakes in the world. In the US, there are about 7 million lakes, and across the globe, there are about 120 million lakes. But not very many of these systems actually have data. The data are sparse, they're highly heterogeneous, and they conform pretty much to a power distribution, which means that a few of the lakes have almost all the data, and most lakes have very little data at all. Water quality in lakes is an emergent property of ecosystems. It derives from the interactions of the physics and the chemistry and the biology of the systems, external controls and internal feedbacks. They're space and time scale dependent. And so that makes them really challenging to predict for process models or for black box models as well. And of course, we're always looking for an evolution of methods that maps onto the available resources or the resources that become available to us. KGML sits in a programmatic sense within the broader topic of harnessing the data revolution. And I've listed here on the screen a number of features of the harnessing the data revolution that include human resources right over to research. You'll hear some talks today that talk specifically about process modeling and machine learning in KGML. But KGML is pretty new to our field. And so some of the talks today will deal with other aspects of harnessing the data revolution. The important thing to remember is that these diversity of ideas and diversity of input should inspire, I think, more questions than we have answers. And so there are great opportunities here to think about the ways we all may collaborate on some of these issues. I'm going to switch gears and give you a specific example of the implementation of KGML in a lake, Lake Mendota, Wisconsin, which is in Madison. And it's a pretty simple example. It models lake phosphorus. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient for primary production in lakes and is responsible at high concentrations for harmful algal blooms and other water quality problems. This bar that you see at the top is a picture of the surface of Lake Mendota, which is covered in a scum of algae. And even though we know a lot about phosphorus dynamics in lakes, we really haven't done much prediction over scales that range from the short time scale, let's say days, up to decades. And so we thought we'd give that a go. And so our goal here was to improve predictions over these broad time scales in this lake. And we used 3 different approaches: a process-only model, recurrent neural network, and then of course combining those two to create the KGML. Process model was a very typical approach that we would use in modeling biogeochemistry in a lake. This is a schematic of a lake during the summertime when it's thermally stratified. The upper layer of the lake is warm. It's called the uplimnion. It's where we would swim. The lower layer in the lake is called the hypolimnion. It's cold. And when it becomes anoxic, it is a place where cold water fish species end up dying. And the third layer in the system here is the sediments. So phosphorus comes in from the catchment. It is processed within the lake. Some of it is stored, some of it's recycled, some of it's exported downstream. And our goal is to try to understand those dynamics. So we have a process model, but we also have the machine learning only model. In this case, it's a recurrent neural network. It takes the observational data, all these different time series, runs them through the RNN to make a set of predictions. Pretty straightforward from a machine learning perspective. What makes it KGML is we take the output of the process model and we provide it as another input for the recurrent neural network. But also we enforce an ecological principle on the right-hand side here of the objective function or the loss function as the model tries to fit the data. The ecological principle we're enforcing here is called -1 log-log scaling. It's very common to environmental data that most of the power is in long time scales and there's less power in short time scales. This power distribution then is enforced within this modeling paradigm to make sure the predictions from the neural network create a power distribution that's pretty similar to what we have in the observational data. So let's go straight to the results. So we have 3 different rows of results here. The top row is the process only. The middle row is recurrent neural network only. And then the bottom row is the KGML. This black line is the observational data in all the different plots. And it's the signal we're trying to recreate. Phosphorus in Lake Mendota is highly dynamic with a very strong annual signal to it. It's highest in the winter. It's lowest in the summer. We're particularly interested in predicting summer values well, because that's when harmful algal blooms occur. The process-only model does a pretty good job of capturing the annual dynamics in the system, but it misses some of these high events early in the time series, and then decades later, misses some of the lower events. This doesn't look like much, but this turns out to be a significant miss on the predictions. The recurrent neural network does a better job than the process model by quite a bit, actually. But you'll see a lot of high frequency jitter in the recurrent neural network and values that when you look at them closely, don't represent realistic changes in the system. Naturally, the PGML gives us the best predictions. It's a little bit hard to see and appreciate here, and I think it's demonstrated a little bit better on the right side, even though these are statistically significant better results on the left. On the right, we have the seasonal time series for winter and summer over the 20 years. And the process only model does a pretty good job of getting some of the time dynamics, but look, it missed entirely the long-term trend that's in the system, both true for summer and winter. The recurrent neural network did a better job of picking up the long-term trend, although it didn't quite get it here, but definitely missed some of the important changes we're seeing in summer over the 2 decades. And the PGRNN, or the KGML approach, pretty much nailed the long-term trend and gave us the best dynamics in the system. So what did we learn? This is my last slide here, wrapping up. KGML provided feedback on ecosystem process. Although I didn't show these results, the process model was the most important predictor for the KGML paradigm. However, it did downweight it by about 20% and reassigned some of the variants we thought should go to process into temperature. So we learned something about our model, that maybe we didn't even have exactly the right model and we could make some changes there. KGML was the most accurate in making its predictions. And it also gave us some information about some of our next steps that you'll hear a little bit about in some of the other presentations. But I think the final take-home point I want to make is we've learned a lot through this process and through our collaborations with our colleagues in computer science, and there's huge room for development and application of KGML framework for all of us. It's a really exciting time to be in the aquatic sciences. So thank you, and we'll switch over to Robert.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, hello everybody. So I hope you can see that. My name is Robert Ladwig, and I want to talk about an ongoing research project that we are doing at UW Madison. So in collaboration with the USGS and the University of Minnesota, we are currently also doing the modeling of lake oxygen dynamics. So here the concentrations of dissolved oxygen, or DO, in lakes, of course, depend on the abundance of sources and sink terms. And here in lakes, sources can be, for example, photosynthesis or the exchange with the atmosphere, whereas sinks can be the mineralization of organic matter, redox reactions, or just a depletion by the sediment. And most lakes in these climate zones here, they stratify during summer, which means that we have warm water on top of cold water. So as you can see here on this bottom plot, this shows you like the typical dynamics of oxygen as a heat map. So the x-axis is the time, and the y-axis is the depth, and the color shows you the concentration of oxygen from a high value in yellow to a one close to zero in dark blue. And now in June, we have stratified conditions, which mean we have the warm water on top of the cold water. And here the surface warm water layer is also called the epilimnion, and this cold bottom layer is called the hypolimnion. And due to this formation of 2 distinct layers, we have very low. Oh yeah.
I'm still seeing your title slide. I don't know if that's true.
But it worked before, I swear.
It did work before.
So can you see it?
I see your title slide.
Bring your shared window to the front. I'm really sorry for that. Let me try this again.
Now I see your second slide.
Now you can see it?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is the figure I talked about for like a minute now. So you can see the surface layer and the bottom layer. And because we have the formation of these 2 distinct layers, there is a low transport going on between them because we have a low vertical diffusivity, which means in the bottom layer, we have a depletion of oxygen. So we have very low concentrations because there is no source available. And as you can see here in lakes, oxygen has dynamics, at least a seasonal one due to stratification. And also the depletion of oxygen is an emergent ecosystem property, which means it's really hard to predict because it depends on multiple factors like the catchment, the climate, or the biomass in the lake. So this is our first research question. So what is driving the different dynamics of oxygen on different timescales? And do these drivers change over the different timescales? So for example, on the daily timescales, you could have wind-induced turbulence that drives oxygen. On a seasonal timescale, you could have stratification. On a year-to-year timescale, you could have the impact of, for example, flash floods, so extreme events. And on decadal timescale, you could have climate change or a shift in the ecosystem that is driving oxygen. And also in this project, we wanted to look at the oxygen dynamics in lakes in Wisconsin. So we are really lucky here because we have the NTL-LGR program, which is a monitoring program which is active since the 1980s. So we have long-term data sets about our lakes here. So these lake ecosystems are well understood and studied systems. So in this study, we included 5 lakes from the north. These are nutrient-poor lakes that are influenced by a forest catchment. And we also added 4 lakes from the south. These are nutrient-rich lakes, and they are heavily influenced by an urban and agricultural catchment. So our main research question here was, what is driving the difference between the rural northwoods against the urban south? And for this, we built a process-based oxygen model, which we call ODEM, which is short for Oxygen Depletion Model. And so next 10 minutes, I want to talk about this process-based model. And at the end, I want to talk about potential links to machine learning. So in this process-based model, we either assume that the lake is stratified or mixed. So in summer, we assume stratified conditions, which means we are quantifying an oxygen concentration in the surface layer. And we are also quantifying one in the bottom layer. And as you can see on the left side, all these concentrations are influenced by different flux terms. For example, the exchange with the atmosphere, the net ecosystem production, or also a transport between the top and the bottom. And there's also a sink by the sediment. But once the layer shifts to mixed conditions, we only have one layer. So we are only tracking down the total dissolved oxygen concentration. And here, this ordinary differential equation is just expressed at the end as a set of linear difference equations. So how does ODEM work? So as input data, we have the results from a very well calibrated hydrodynamic model done by GLM. And this model predicts the water temperature profiles over the depth on a daily basis. This temperature data to quantify if the lake is stratified or mixed, and also how much volume is in the top and in the bottom layer. We are also feeding into ODEM lake-specific data, like the area-to-depth relationship, and also meteorological data, like wind speed and air temperature. And at the end, at the bottom here, you can see how ODEM works. For example, at the beginning, the lake could be completely mixed, so we only quantify one oxygen concentration. Then summer kicks in, so now we have 2 layers. We have the surface and the bottom layer. And at the end, we have again a shift to completely mixed conditions. At this moment, we are ignoring winter stratification dynamics in this process-based model. So how did we do the model fitting? So all these fluxes I have shown earlier, they all depend on an ideal flux rate, which we call flux 20, which is kind of a black box. So we are using STAN, which is a Bayesian statistical model to estimate these flux 20 parameters by running multiple chains of the model again and again. And every time when we had a new observed data point for oxygen, we estimated these flux 20 parameters again, and also when there was a shift from stratified to mixed conditions or vice versa. And here to do this all in a Bayesian way, we also assumed at the beginning that all these flux 20 parameters follow a normal distribution, and that every subsequent estimation of these flux 20 parameters depends on the prior mean. And in this way, we implemented some kind of random walk into the model fitting. So each lake was fitted specifically with this Bayesian model, and we got very well replications of the oxygen dynamics for each lake. And I want to show you like the first results for time series fits. So here you can see the time series of Lake Mendota. So every plot shows you 1 year The x-axis is the day of the year and the y-axis is the oxygen concentration. Here the lines show you the modeled results and the dots show you the observed data. And red is the surface layer, green the bottom layer, and blue dots are observed data points during mixed conditions. And as you can see here for this Lake Mendota, the results are very good. So our model replicates the dynamics of oxygen very well. If we quantify the fit for all the lakes, as you can see here on the right side with a plot of the next Sutcliffe coefficient of efficiency on the x-axis against the root mean squared error on the y-axis, most of our lakes have an NSE above 0.85, so a really good fit. And also the RMSE is below 1 milligram per liter. We only have one outlier, which is on the top right. This is Lake Winkwa, which mixes often during summer. It's also nutrient rich and is a very shallow lake. And so now we know that these configurations of lake systems, they don't work with our process-based model. So this is a really important limitation that we now know. So I want to show some results of the process-based modeling. So here you can see the total sum of all the fluxes over 1 year. So the seasonal dynamics of this total flux, which is the total net ecosystem production. So to simplify this, if this value is above 0, we have a storage of carbon in the lake, or if it's below 0, the lake is emitting carbon into the environment. And here the solid lines show you the northern lakes and the dotted lines show you the southern lakes. And you can really see that these two catchments are distinct to each other. So at about day 150, we have a huge negative flux in the southern lake. So they are emitting carbon into the environment. And this is like in late spring, early summer. And then if you go to summer, first the northern lakes peak and then the southern lakes peak. So they are then storing carbon. And at the end in fall, all these lakes have a negative flux again. But still you can see these lakes are really different to each other, which is due to the catchment and also the lake type. So this was like one of the early interesting findings we got for Wisconsin. And we also tried to generalize the patterns of how fast does the oxygen depletion happen. So here on the left side, you can see, or please remember that sometimes the green line goes like really fast or sometimes really low. So the concentration at the bottom. And now we cluster these responses over time. So this big plot shows you the oxygen concentration on the y-axis against the time of summer. So the x-axis goes from 0 to 100% of summer is over. And the southern lakes mostly have this yellow response, which is a convex response. So they have an early high depletion and at about 50% of summer, the oxygen concentrations are nearly depleted and they stay low. Whereas most northern lakes have this concave response. So they have high concentration throughout the middle of summer and then the depletion kicks in. So the first result showed us that these lake types are really different and that we can learn a lot about how they work in general. But now we would love to advance our ecosystem understanding. So we have this process-based model that replicates the data very well, but it doesn't include all the important processes because it's simplified. And we also have lots of monitoring data from our LTER program. So now we want to dig deeper and explore more of our data set. And we have two big questions. The first one is, what are the causal relationships between the different drivers or variables? And also, what are the important empirical relationships that we have neglected now, but they could be important for the next iteration of ODEM? And of course, there are like all these classical approaches, but we now would want to apply machine learning. So we tried two things for now. We did causal networking. So we used the PCMCI algorithm to create this causal dependency structure. So you can see how different water quality variables depend on each other. So a line shows you the dependency. If it's red, there is more or less a positive correlation. If it's blue, there's a negative one. And the number shows you the lag. And here you can see, like for the surface layer, phosphorus, nitrogen, algae biomass, light extinction, the flux of net ecosystem production, and also organic carbon. And we just did this for Lake Mendota as a first try attempt. And we could learn a lot about the temporal relationship. For example, there's a strong correlation between the ecosystem production and the algae biomass, as well as the light extinction, which was expected. And there's also a strong inverse relationship between the ecosystem production and the nutrients. So we would like to dig into this more and to advance this to really understand the temporal relationships. The second thing that we tried was to use a recurrent neural network. And in this case, our Flux20 parameter, so the parameters, so the ones that were calibrated for our process-based model, were now used as our targets. And using this RNN, we now wanted to see which ones of the input variables are important or sensitive. And here on the lower right, you can see a first result. So the RNN is able to replicate the dynamics of the NEP20 parameter, so the net ecosystem production. And we also did like a really simple sensitivity study, and we got to know that for the NEP20 predictions, the air temperature, the thermocline depth, and the phosphorus in the bottom layer were the most important ones. So this is also a really interesting first result that we could use to advance our process-based model for the next step. So yeah, currently we are here. We want to really advance what we can learn about oxygen depletions. We have all the results from the process-based modeling, plus more and more data from our long-term data set. So we know the groundwater table and we know nutrient concentrations in the inflow. And now we also would like to hear your feedback, what you think is a good approach, what is a good framework to either use data-driven modeling or approaches like causal networks, or maybe use machine learning to discover like processes that we have to use in the next iteration of ODIM. Because in the next step, we want to scale up from Wisconsin to the continental US scale. So we want to go from 9 lakes to 1,000 or more. And here, new points of focus will be to look at winter dynamics, which is, of course, more important on the continental scale. And we also want to use knowledge-guided machine learning for oxygen. So what Paul explained before for phosphorus, we also want to use this now for oxygen to learn more and to improve our predictions. So yeah, to sum up, at the beginning, we know a lot about the different drivers of oxygen on different timescales. So we built this process-based Bayesian hydrodynamic water quality model, which was calibrated very well and also replicates the lakes very well. Plus, we have all this long-term monitoring data set. So now we are looking for the best sustainable data-driven framework to get to know these causal relationships and also to discover new or important hidden processes. And at the end, in the future, in the next study, we want to scale up to do large-scale KGML modeling for oxygen. So yeah, that's the ODIM project. And yeah, thank you a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Robert. That was really interesting. We don't have any questions via Slido at the moment, but I would encourage people to ask them. And we also have a 20-minute panel at the end of the session where any questions that you ask on Slido that aren't answered or that might apply generally to all the talks we'll get to at the end. So definitely feel free to leave some questions there and we'll be sure to answer them.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So my name is Willard. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Computer Science, working in the Kumar Lab and also with the USGS Water Resources Data Science team. And my talk is titled Process-Guided Metatransfer Learning for Predicting Temperature of Unmonitored Lake Systems. So Allison kind of already touched on the importance of lake temperature, but I'll just go through the main takeaways are that it's a very ecologically important variable. And this work in particular focuses on predicting lake temperature in one dimension, so temperature at various depths within the lake. So when predicting complex dynamical systems like temperature, which is thermodynamically driven, there are two primary classes of methods. The first being the traditional process-based models, process-driven models, which usually expressed through things like differential equations to explain emergent phenomena and mapping inputs to outputs, and then parameterizing missing physics, as many of you are probably already familiar with. And then on the other side of the coin, you have these data-driven models, which are all the rave these days, things like machine learning and more recently deep learning, which can take advantage of the millions and billions of sometimes data points available for modeling tasks as sensors get better and better. But in certain environmental systems, you don't have this massive data availability. So how can we apply things like deep learning, which have this extremely high data dependence often? So for example, for the USGS goal of modeling 100,000 plus lakes, over 95% of these actually don't have any temperature observations. So how can we apply things like deep learning, which have shown to predict lake temperature pretty accurately if you have a lot of data? But how can we harness these state-of-the-art data-driven or process-guided data-driven models when we don't actually have any data? So the key idea from machine learning that's important for tasks like these is known as transfer learning. So in this case, given an unmonitored lake system, we would want to find models from similar well-monitored systems, which we'll call source systems. And we aim to transfer these to a new lake that might not have any observations, and we'll call this the target system. And some of the biggest challenges in transfer learning, across disciplines are, what models do we transfer? What kind of models do we transfer? And from what systems? And in this work, we'll use ideas that use things like contextual lake attributes to determine, what is similar or what is transferable, which I'll talk about in later slides. So Alison already kind of talked about the idea of process-guided deep learning models, or also known as knowledge-guided or physics-guided. It goes by many names, but basically the key features are that these are deep learning models with temporal awareness. They have scientific theory-based feedback, and they also use pre-training to incorporate synthetic data from process-based simulations of lakes. And these have been shown to outperform process-based models in many situations, and also outperform data-driven models that have things like deep learning that have no knowledge of the underlying physics. So that's why we choose them as our candidate models. And these are candidate models for source models that would be transferred to target systems for prediction. So in terms of selecting the best models to transfer, we pose this as a meta-learning problem, which the idea is to build a model of models mapping differences in contextual attributes between lake systems and mapping those to model performance when you transfer a model to another lake. And so attributes can include things like maximum depth, surface area, among other things. And the idea is that in the model space here on the right, we would have source models built on every well-observed lakes that you would consider using as a source. And to build up the data to train the meta model. So this data to train the meta model consists of lake characteristics that aren't water temperature measurements, but things like depth and surface area, and mapping those to model performance here. And this data set is constructed by applying every source model to every other source lake. So if you had n sources, it'd be n times n minus 1 data points used to train the meta model. And ideally, you would learn systematically things like, lakes that have similar depths might transfer well, or lakes with surface area, similar surface area might transfer well, and things like that. So once the meta model is trained, given a new lake, you would use the lake characteristics of that lake to inform the meta model's prediction of which source models would be best transferred to that target lake. And more simply, just because this is a kind of complicated figure, we first use machine learning models, PGDL models from data-rich lakes. The meta-learning model maps contextual data to performance. And then given an unobserved lake, we use contextual data to map it to PGDLs from similar systems. And then just in mathematical format, the response variable here would be the model error when transferring source to target. And that's built off the metadata that I talked about earlier. There's some examples here. And the model we choose to use for this regression task is gradient boosting regression. This outperformed several other methods like random forest regression, support vector regression, linear regression, and neural network when applied using cross-validation to the source model set. So in terms of selecting which meta features or lake characteristics to use, we use recursive feature elimination using cross-validation on the gradient boosting model. And we kind of just threw everything in the kitchen sink at it in terms of candidate meta features, but they're basically divided into 4 different categories. We have contextual lake data, so things like the difference in max depth between the source and the target system, difference in surface area, etc. And then the second category are observation statistics. So this would be things like, how many times was the source model observed to train, or how many times was the source system observed to train the source model? And, what's the average depth that they measured temperature at in that lake and things like that, which could be important for transferability. And then we have meteorological statistics. And then there's actually only one in this category, which is the process-based model simulation statistics. So this would be things like if you simulated the target and the source lake using a general lake model, what % of the year is it stratified in each case. And after performing this feature selection, we choose 8 meta features out of the 102, the most important being maximum depth and surface area. And then there are also a few more minor ones like number of source observations. So for the experiment of if this meta transfer learning can effectively predict lake temperature of unmonitored lake systems, we use data from the USGS data release process guided deep learning predictions of lake water temperature. And we designate 145 lakes, mostly in the Minnesota, Wisconsin, but in the general Midwest area. We designate 145 of the most observed lakes as the source lakes to train the source models. And then we treat 305 other lakes as unobserved, shown in the dark blue here. And then we hold out another 2,000 or so lakes in light blue here for further analysis, but they're not actually usually well observed in that case, but it's shown more for scaling analysis. So the results of the meta transfer learning framework are compared against the PB0, which in this case is the GLM model, which has been expertly parameterized, but has not been calibrated using any data. And the 3 rows here represent 3 different iterations of the meta transfer learning framework. The middle here, the middle row is going to be what I've explained so far, mostly, which is using the meta model to select the top predicted PGDL source model and then transfer that to the target lake for each of the 305 lakes. And then the bottom row here is going to be a slightly expanded version of that, which instead of transferring just one source model, it transfers an ensemble of source models, which then combine all their predictions into an average prediction, which, if you're familiar with ensemble modeling, can improve prediction if you have diversity among different sources. And the top row here is also interesting because it's the exact same experiment as the middle row, selecting a single source, but instead of using 145 PGDL source models, we instead use 145 calibrated GLM source models. So these don't actually use any deep learning, but it's just, can we transfer parameters calibrated on well-observed systems and transfer them to unobserved systems? And is that predictable using a meta model? So we see that the best performance is in the bottom here. Using the ensemble model, we get an RMSE of about 1.92 degrees Celsius, as opposed to the existing process-based approach for predicting unmonitored systems, which has a median RMSE of about 2.6. And then the middle row here sits at about 2.18. And the calibrated GLM transfer is 2.4. So we do still see an improvement transferring the calibrated GLM models as opposed to just using the uncalibrated model from the target system itself. And I also just briefly highlighted the efficiency of the PGDL approach. Even in the ensemble case where you're selecting 9 models, it can predict 40 years of data, in a matter of seconds, which is often PGDL or deep learning models often execute faster than process-based models. So that's another advantage of that. So as a quick follow-up experiment, we wanted to compare how many observations are needed to forego the meta-transfer learning framework and just use a PGDL model or another data-driven model from the lake itself. And so here we have an additional data point, which is this black line, which shows how well does the PGDL model do when trained on the data from the lake itself. So on the far left here, you would have a PGDL model trained on just one water temperature profile. And as we move along the x-axis, we increase the data and performance also improves, which is expected because it's a data-driven model. And then these green lines here, the light green is the PGDL MTL model, which is the best selected source PGDL model transferred to each of the target lakes, which we saw before the error was around 2.2. And then the ensemble approach would be 1.9 here in the dark green line. And we see that the crossover point for the ensemble model is actually a significant amount of data. Most lakes don't have this 35 or so observations available, and which is interesting. And the crossover point for the single source meta-transfer learning model is around 5. And these are kind of the two extremes. So you have the meta-transfer learning using no data, and then you have the PGDL using all the data. But you might imagine further work or different approaches that would use both. So you have things like, model agnostic meta learning, or maybe you would fine tune a selected source model using data from the target lake or similar approaches. But this is just a comparison of how well the PGDL does as you add more data to the unobserved prediction case. So I also want to highlight the generality of the meta-transfer learning framework. It's not limited to lake temperature prediction. And as long as you have the minimum requirements, which are, you have contextual data for monitored and unmonitored data domains that could inform transferability, and you have, the monitoring data to actually train a data-driven model or calibrated process-based model. And then you have input drivers so that you could run the models on both the target and source system. This framework can apply. So in conclusion, for the studied lakes in the Midwest, PGDL MTL can accurately and efficiently predict daily lake temperature profiles, often less than 2 degrees RMSE for hundreds or thousands of lakes. And the meta learning can effectively learn from past experience to predict the best model for transferring to these ungauged systems. And going with the theme of this workshop, integrating scientific knowledge into machine learning shows promise for predictions of many societally relevant environmental variables, especially given the generality of this framework and many other approaches you will see described in this workshop. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jared. So actually, I have a question for you. This work that you're doing with your USGS collaborators and team seems very novel in the field of limnology in terms of using these ML models to predict characteristics of lakes that we don't know anything about. And I'm wondering if you wanted to say something about how you developed the methods. Is this something that your team sort of trialed and errored through, or is this something that you've seen used elsewhere and sort of adapted it to this project?
So this methodology kind of came out of, thinking about how we can predict lakes with no data. And then I kind of connected that to existing work in transfer learning. And then at first we just tried to transfer lakes, that were like nearby or that only looked at depth in a very like naive way. And all these approaches were insufficient. And then we kind of tried to pose it as a regression problem, like in the gradient boosting regression, but then that kind of opened the door to, what is this called in computer science actually? And then we discovered this entire wealth of work regarding meta learning, which actually hasn't been a hugely active field until very recently. And until then it was, back in the 90s when they were doing meta learning for model selection. But yeah, it's basically, to answer your question, mostly trial and error and connecting it to existing subfields.
Yeah, no, that's really neat. I think that's sort of important for, us who are thinking about trying to apply some of these methods, knowing the background of kind of how you got to where you are currently. So one more question for you from Slido. The question is, for matching these lakes, are you using any optical properties of the lake? So thinking about average color, lake color, or variation in color.
Yeah, so one of the candidate meta features, we did use water clarity as a candidate meta feature, but it didn't seem to inform transferability that much. That said, this approach hasn't been expanded, into like other regions where different features might prove important for different sets of lakes.
Yeah, and was that clarity static? Was there sort of one value per lake, or is that something that you left?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the static value.
Okay. Interesting. Oh, great. Thanks, Jared. I think if there's no more questions, we will move on to our next speaker, who is Matt Ross from Colorado State University.
Hey, everybody. And unmute like 7 mics. So I'm excited to give a talk today. I feel like a lot of the other ones were really nice and detailed. Mine's going to be a bit more of a pitch and an overview of sort of how I think we can incorporate remote sensing a lot more into a lot of these approaches we've been talking about. And I was the one that asked Jared about color. I was thinking about some work that I'll show here where we are using color to sort of inform how we model lakes that we don't have a lot of in situ data. So I'm going to talk about the importance of open access training data for global scale remote sensing of water quality. My name's the only one here, but this is with a huge group, and you'll see names pop up as I talk about specific collaborators and projects. So I hope it's clear from this talk so far that a lot of what is cool and going on in machine learning and AI more generally, not just within the aquatic sciences, requires a lot of data. So this is a really cool little paper I found from a YouTube channel I really like, just showing how they trained a neural net to basically impute sunsets and sunrises on any given static image. And of course, to do this, they had to use videos and images that were in public archives. So they just sort of scraped the web for a bunch of information, and they used 20,000 photos from the internet that were either of sunrise or midday or whatever, and then they built their model based on all this open access data. And I think when you look at traditional development in computer science, the sort of core algorithms are developed on these really radically open public data sets, like photos that you can just scrape off the internet, or other labeled machine learning data sets. And when you think about water quality, there's a bunch of these data sets available. I didn't move my slide early enough, but basically in a bunch of fields, there's tons of these labeled machine learning training data sets. But for remote sensing of water quality, we really haven't had this data as much that is open and labeled and very clear and easy to use. And in this paper by Simon Top, we sort of show that the predictive accuracy of remote sensing models, this is just an R squared, on either the fit of the model or the validation of the model hasn't gotten a ton better in the last several decades. And potentially one of those reasons is that we just don't have large data sets that we can all sort of compare methods across. Traditionally, when doing remote sensing of water quality, people were doing the sort of local study and then doing their validation just on maybe 100 or tens of points actually. And we sort of pitch in this paper that one of the that problem of not having an open access data set led to this long period of decades of time in the remote sensing of inland waters, where we were really focused on two types of analysis in our papers. One was methods with a slight description of patterns, but not really talking about trends and patterns in space and time, and definitely not usually talking about how we can use it to make decisions in the environment. And so I've been mentioning remote sensing of water quality and sort of training data sets, but what is remote sensing of water quality? Basically this image is showing all the different constituents that can control water quality. I'll zoom in a little. And you have a bunch of stuff that controls the color of the water. So you have like cyanobacteria, CDOM, phytoplankton, suspended particulate matter, or total suspended solids if you're a river person. And all of these aggregate to give the water color. And then that water color goes through the atmosphere, is filtered through vapors and clouds and other things, and it finally reaches the satellite. And that's sort of the sensor that we have, is the sensor at the satellite or at the airplane. I'll be talking about satellite remote sensing. And so, this is sort of all the complex things that lead to the water quality, to the color of water we see. And you can use different methods to convert this image, this color, into predictions of how much phytoplankton or CDOM is there. So more simply, you can just think about this from an image over like Florida. Florida has a huge variation in lake color. So at the bottom left of this image, down here, we have a bunch of lakes that are sort of algae bloom rich. And then up to the right, we have more CDOM, DOC, dark lakes. And there's just a large variation in this color. And these images tell us something about the concentration of these constituents in these lakes. And so the way remote sensors talk about this is the inherent optical properties. If a pixel's green, maybe it's going to have more chlorophyll. If it's blue, it's going to maybe be just open water. If it's kind of brownish, it might be color dissolved organic matter. And if it's a bright tan, maybe it's sediments. And so that's just sort of generally how remote sensing works. The real reason that I'm so excited about remote sensing is the sampling density of remote sensing in almost every watershed globally will be far higher if we can turn these images into predictions of constituents than the observations that we have on the ground, the in situ observations. So on the left, this is the Colorado River Basin, the upper Colorado, and on the right is the St. John's River Basin in Florida. The sort of segments of river that are highlighted in bright green have been sampled at least once in the history of the water quality portal. So in the history of sort of the federal government managing water quality data. And then on the left, in the black, has never been sampled. So you can see in the Colorado River, it's relatively poorly sampled, whereas the St. John's River is one of the most highly sampled watersheds in the country. But even there, in the St. John's River, remote sensing sees these water bodies orders of magnitude more frequently and more water bodies, both in terms of lakes and streams, depending on what you're observing. And then it's even more pronounced how much more lake observations you get in the Colorado River compared to in situ. So if we can turn these remote sensing data sets into predictions of constituents, we really will increase our data by hundreds of times. And so we're sort of excited to try to do that. And this is just another way to think about that. This is just the number of overpasses per year from Landsat. So these are these Landsat tiles, and you have increased overpasses where the Landsat overlaps with itself. So that's sort of like over here where the Green River is. The Green River is getting sampled twice as much as this section near Moab, just because it's sort of in between these Landsat scenes. And I'll come back to these figures in a second. And so if we have all these images, how do we turn that into an estimate of water quality? So this is just a figure from a paper that just shows, basically, in this case, as you had increased green reflectance, it was not very predictive of TSS. Increased red reflectance was more predictive. Red edge was much more predictive. And then the near infrared in this case was very predictive of TSS. And so this is just a local empirical approach. And that's a common approach that's been used for a long time in remote sensing, is sort of local empirical. So you go out, you measure a bunch of samples, you either have the satellite or a drone pass over, you make sure you do some local algorithm to figure out, just as simple as this: near predicts TSS with very high accuracy in this case. But that doesn't work when you scale it up. So to go globally, we know that different basins have different sediment concentrations, different clay content, and that's going to change this relationship a bunch. And so to do it more at a national or global scale, we really need large open access data sets. And so to go from local to global, for work in my postdoc, we built this data set called Aquasat. Allison Appling and a bunch of others were helping with that. Tamlin Pavelski, Simon Top, Zhao Yang, and at the University of Washington, David Buttman and Catherine Kuhn. And this video just sort of shows how we built that. This paper is now published, but basically we took the water quality portal, which has been sort of assembled, and every time something flashes sort of tan or purple here, people were taking samples just randomly out in the field of either chlorophyll A, dissolved organic carbon, total suspended sediment, or Secchi depth. And what we did is we took these samples. You can see that in the 80s there was relatively few, and if we go into the sort of 2010s, one of the peak years of data in the water quality portal, you start to see how much we've been sampling the rivers and lakes of the United States over time. And just to be clear, these are only samples on remotely observable rivers and lakes. So rivers that are wider than 60 meters and lakes that are wider than 60 meters on each side. So this is sort of the in situ data set that we need. So now we have in situ concentrations in these water bodies. But to make it viable with remote sensing, we need to combine it with another open access data set. So this is the launch of Landsat 5. So you see the sort of scenes of Landsat 5 as it takes pictures in the country. And as we walk through this video, I might fast forward a little. You can see that we eventually go through different generations of satellites. This is when we have Landsat 7 and 5 going, and then Landsat 5 drops out. So now this is just Landsat 7. And then eventually Landsat 8 comes online. And that's sort of where we're at now with Landsat 7 and 8. Obviously, we also have Sentinel. We didn't deal with Sentinel data in this approach. But in this case, every time something lights up sort of bright cyan, that means that it was a cloud-free image. And the gaps in the satellite data are just because it's too cloudy to use. And so what we did with this approach is we essentially took this data set and the in situ data set, paired them together so that every time someone took a sample randomly in the field, just for some local water quality monitoring program, and we had a satellite image going over it the day before or the day after or the same day, that went into our database, which we called Aquasat. So now every time something's flashing white, we captured that data and we put it in our data set. And that's what we published as an open access data set to encourage more people to do remote sensing of water quality. And I always hate that you can see my YouTube history. I watch a lot of cooking videos on YouTube. So that's our Aquasat data set. We built that one. It was really focused on chlorophyll A, DOC, Secchi depth, and what am I missing? Something else. Total suspended sediment. But Evan Dethier and others, they built another data set that's truly global, covers the Amazon and some other areas, that is focused on sediment, and they have far more sediment samples than we do. So now there's 2 open access data sets for doing remote sensing of water quality. And now I'm just going to walk through some examples of what you can do with this kind of data once you have it. So first we'll talk a little bit about lake clarity. This is work led by Simon Top and the rest of his group. And Zhao Yang and Claire Griffin and Emily Stanley. This is a Wisconsin party here today. And this is just Simon's using a gradient boosting modeling approach. We're talking with folks, everyone at this conference basically, about shifting to a knowledge guided machine learning approach, but we've just been using the gradient boosting approach for now. And so this is just his validation metrics for a national model of water clarity. So this is national for the United States, and this is, he gets an R-squared of 0.72 and an RMSE of around 1 meter. So in any given lake, we're fairly confident we're within 1 meter if we have a Landsat image. And this is for this sort of same day, like any given time, but our results get even better if you're interested in sort of the average behavior of a lake. So this is aggregated for average lake summer clarity. So this is Secchi depth over the summer. And here we have a much tighter fit because we're sort of maybe collapsing some of that noise. And I think we can really improve this approach with some of the KGML stuff we've already talked about. So now that we have this data, we have this model, we can apply it to a bunch of lakes all across the country. So what Simon did is he took the National Lake Assessment data set, and then he took data from 1984 to 2019, And he applied his model and looked at clarity variation in the National Lakes Assessment data, which is sampled once every 5 or 10 years. I can't remember right now. And then he also took a totally random sample of lakes all throughout the country. NLA is supposed to be representative, sort of average lakes in these different regions, but we just took another random sample of 20,000 additional lakes. And we have Secudus depth for them on average about once a month since 1984. And what we show in this paper, what Simon really shows, is that there's a lot of narrative from in situ based data sets on the far right here that water clarity in a lot of places is decreasing. So basically things are getting murkier. And that's sort of what some of the in situ data sets showed on the far right. But if you look at this random sample of lakes, or just the lakes that we have in the National Lake Assessment, we actually saw a far more consistent increase in water clarity. So by having so much more lakes that are observed so much more consistently, and in particular small lakes that are not problematic, because if you remember, we're using the water quality portal for a lot of these in situ studies, and the water quality portal data comes from agencies monitoring lakes. Well, which lakes get monitored? The ones that are problematic often. And so if you look at all lakes, essentially a random sampling of all lakes, you see far more consistent trends of increasing clarity, which is sort of surprising, and maybe some evidence that things like the Clean Water Act, in particular in cities, because we see the fastest increases in clarity around cities, maybe they're working a little bit. So this is some results we're just sort of right off the press. This is in review, and Simon Top led that at UNC Chapel Hill. So that's lake clarity. John Gardner at UNC again is working on riverine sediment, and Zhao Yang is working with us too, and Tamlin Pavelski and Simon as well. And what John has done is take the same approach as Simon. So he has a model, a gradient boosting model again, for rivers all across the country now using Aquasat data. And he's predicting total suspended solids. So how much sediment is in these rivers. And this is a national model again, and we're getting percent error of around 18% and a median error of 12 milligrams per liter and an RMSE of 30. So not bad, given that we're applying this model at once everywhere with relatively little local data. All we're using locally is the elevation of the river. And so we'll sort of just zoom back in on these two watersheds. This is the Colorado River. And actually, I'm just going to focus on the Colorado River. And this is where I sort of applied some of John's sediment models. And we can do really cool stuff with these models. So this is just a map of the Colorado River that is in one Landsat tile. And so you get about 200 kilometers of continuous observation from Grand Junction to sort of Lake Powell. And we can see just average TSS here. So as you're going down, of course, and you get the Gunnison River coming in, you pick up some extra sediment. And then you really see this big increase in sediment down river as you hit the Green River, but not for long, because then you go into the sort of slow water moving down here at Lake Powell. So you have this really sort of beautiful image of what is the average conditions of the sediment. But again, with remote sensing, we can do more. We can look at the not just the average conditions, but the sort of conditions at any given time. So when there's a Landsat satellite overhead and it's relatively cloud-free. So this is just the total suspended solid concentrations going from the sort of upstream that we just saw up near Grand Junction all the way down to Lake Powell. And this is just near the max discharge of the Colorado River. And what you can see here is relatively consistent lines where we're basically increasing sediment. You can think of this as snowmelt in this region, where all at once the whole landscape is wet and supplying a bunch of sediment downstream, and it's consistent. As every river comes in, you have a relatively consistent increase. In black is the sort of average condition. And these individual lines are different days, but they sort of mirror the average condition. And that's really different from the mean Q. So now we're at mean Q. We're going to be later in the summer in this region. That's extremely, the hydrology is really driven in the late summer by random patchy thunderstorms. And you get to see that in what I've been calling the spaghetti diagram. So this is sort of just showing the same profile, but we have the sediment profile that's completely different. And you can see different tributaries contribute sediment at different times. And so we're really able to unpack the sort of landscape metrics of what's going on. Is the Green River diluting the Colorado River? Is it adding sediment from these images? And this is sort of just the really early phases of this work. I'm just going to keep going. Riverine DOC, we can do the same thing. This is with Matt Cohen and Jim Jowitz at the University of Florida. So again, same Aquasat basic thing. We're using gradient boosting again. I totally am aware that we should probably try a new model approach. We've compared a bunch. For now, gradient boosting has worked the best. Again, we have pretty low error, 15% error on DOC in the Florida St. John's River. And so again, here we can just see really neat patterns. You have sort of low DOC going in and out of these lakes, which are maybe spring fed. And then Matt tells me that this is a really wetland rich area. And so these brighter yellow areas have higher DOC. And then they go into Lake George, and here you get a lot of spring water coming in. And so it's diluting that DOC. And so you can just see really neat spatial patterns with this data, and spinning these models up, because Aquasat is open access, is actually super fast and easy. And we're trying to publish a lot of the tools to do this so that more people start to use this approach in their assessment of water quality. And again, this could be local or global work that you could do with the same sort of data sets. So that's the DOC. I'm going to just rip through the algae dynamics. So basically, we've worked with some folks in France to apply this at a different river, and we've worked in Loire. We don't predict chlorophyll A with a ton of accuracy. The RMSE on this is like, or the error, RMSE error on this is about 80%, so not great. But in general, we actually still see strong trends that are consistent with what in situ data sets show, which is that the Loire River has a decreasing concentration of chlorophyll A and TSS. And then really cool, we can show that basically the reason that is that macrophytes, which used to be stuck in the upper watershed, oh no, it's not playing. That's a GIF. Oh well. Imagine this GIF shifting where the blue in the bottom crawls upstream. So macrophytes are essentially crawling downstream and choking off sediment and chlorophyll A. And so even though the primary productivity in the system is the same, it's actually shifted from being basically mostly pelagic algae to macrophyte dominated. And I'm gonna say future work real quick. We know we're gonna use KGML, PGDL. We're trying to do some transfer learning. This is in red is remote sensing, or in red is in situ observations of Secchi disk depth in a lake in Honduras based on predictions from our national US model, subsetted to lakes that have similar color. And we're sort of trying to do this. I think I'm gonna try to talk to Jared about how to do it more intelligently. And yeah, we want to integrate lake, river, and coastal approaches. And I'll just sort of stop there. I think I would like to have maybe one question.
Matt, that was fantastic. And there actually are a handful of questions. Just to let everyone know, we have a break scheduled from 3 to 3:10, but I'm gonna probably let Matt's questions bleed a little bit into that, just a heads up. So Matt, in no particular order on these questions, can you talk specifically about the software or code and processing platform that you use?
Yeah.
Is it cloud-based?
This is cool. This is, we developed this with Allison and Simon, and basically all of this is done in R and occasionally our markdown calling Python. So this is Google Earth Engine. And for those, if there's any remote sensors in the audience, we're using surface reflectance from the USGS. So we're not processing the imagery with any specific atmospheric correction or anything. We're just using what's out there already to sort of increase the scale at which we can do this. So yeah, it's mostly local, and then it's cloud-based sort of when we grab imagery.
Nice. Have you tried to perform any predictions ahead of time? For example, forecasting color of water from some other kind of covariates?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I've written a lot of proposals to do that, but none of them have gotten funded. We want to do that. I think that's where the KGML approach is vital. Frankly, our approach is agnostic to mechanism at all. So we shove just whatever data we can to get a reasonable prediction that works well on validation and test data sets. And so there's zero process. And so I think if you're thinking along the lines of like Kaylin Carey's work and others where you would want to predict maybe a week or two ahead about overturn or if there's going to be a bloom, I think our data could drive models that use our data to sort of do something more like what the previous talks were about. But right now I wouldn't use our data to predict forward.
Great. Do you take into account any spatial dependence
Oh,
Or is the
gosh.
analysis conducted considering just a given pixel in time?
Yeah, it's mostly pixel level, and again, that's a fantastic idea. And for river lake continuum, we just submitted a proposal to do exactly this, because obviously, like Allison's talk, having a network aware prediction is clearly the best way to sort of get network scale predictions, because you want to be able to say like, hey, if sediment is 7 in this reach and there's no incoming tributary or anything, it should probably be something around 7 in the next reach. And we don't do that now, and it's a clear point of improvement, just like it would be a very clear point of improvement to include some reasonable process knowledge, like, hey, it definitely rained in this basin, so it probably is going to increase sediment and things like that.
Yeah. And so the last question is sort of a dual question. Could new remote sensing data be used as additional drivers, which can be helpful in a KGML setting? For example, if clarity was available as a continuous variable rather than a fixed parameter, could that improve your models?
Yeah, that's exactly what I have talked to Jordan and Allison about doing, where we would maybe use Simon's clarity output to help drive some of their temperature models, for example. Or in Jared's talk, I was thinking, well, if he knew the sort of color variation, not just psychodist depth once, but like, probably once a month, and we could think about like matching profiles based on their variation in color, I think it could drive these more KGML models. I think they can like feed to each other. We could get better predictions using remote sensing, and I think the KGML models would do well to use it. And you could just use the raw imagery even in the KGML, because it would sort of figure out the relationship. So anyways, that we've been having those conversations, but so far haven't done it. And I'm really excited to work on that front. So if anyone wants to, please email me.
And my personal question following on that is, are there new satellites coming online that could vastly improve some of the like potential water quality variables?
Yeah, so Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 are already far better than 5 and 7. So big upgrade by having this ultra blue band. And then there's actually a development. It's always funny talking about satellites. There's a development team working on a satellite that's launching in 2027. So, for the young in the crowd, we can still get on that one. And that's an inland water quality satellite. So it is built for our community. I don't know a ton about it because it's in this like engineering phase, but that's one thing. And then a pitch that I'm constantly making is that when SWAT launches, which will sort of, the promise of SWAT is global estimates of discharge for every river bigger than 90 meters, and global lake height, therefore global lake volume for every lake larger than 250 meters on a side. To me, that has to be paired with water quality estimates. So Landsat 9 and Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 sister really well with other satellite missions that are about to launch. So that's like SWAT and then NISAR too. So there's a bunch of things that I think, I'm not from this community, I did my PhD in totally other things, that it's very exciting to think about how we can use it, but it's actually very hard. It's a big barrier. And our group is really trying to lower that barrier to make doing these kinds of, I want to know what Colorado River sediment is, and just making that like a couple days instead of like a whole PhD.
Excellent. Well, I think we all appreciate that.
Well, we need to share it first.
All right, I'll let you off the hook for questions for now. So we're gonna take a 7-minute break and resume talks at 1:10 Central.